Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I have a very important video. I'm going to be debunking ContraPoints on the subject of autogynephilia. So, if you don't know who ContraPoints is, she is a transgender YouTube creator who is known for high production values, long video essays, philosophical content relating to a lot of transgender topics. And ContraPoints is very well respected within the trans community, very influential. And so her video that she did 6 years ago on autogynephilia continues to be cited as a definitive debunking of the validity of autogynephilia as a concept. Um, so I had a someone in my audience recommend I react to this, and it's like a 48-minute, 49-minute long video essay on the topic of autogynephilia. So I'm just going to jump into it. I'm going to just watch it and react as I go along. So this is going to be a long video, fair warning, because I'm going to stop it anytime I have a disagreement. So it's gonna, so take 50 minutes and then add in my commentary. This is going to be a long video. So strap in and let's get going. She's reading The Man Who Would Be Queen by Michael Bailey, which is pretty nice. I don't even have a copy of that. It's actually a pretty expensive book. So good for her.
In 1989, a sex researcher named Ray Blanchard published a controversial, provocative, politically incorrect theory claiming that trans women are not, as custom has it, essentially female souls accidentally born into male bodies. Instead, he claimed, they are men of two types: gay men who love straight men and straight men who love themselves. For the latter condition,
I mean, technically, what Blanchard talked about was that they're male, and this idea that they're saying, oh, they're just men, that is imposing an ideological framework onto this theory already in order to paint it as transphobic. Oh, Blanchard is just calling trans women men, so therefore he's transphobic. No, we need to think about this in the context of biological sex, males and females. And male sexuality is different than female sexuality, and he was focused on male to female transsexualism. So right away, we can see the sort of setup that ContraPoints is doing to paint Blanchard as a bigot and a transphobe or whatever. So okay, I just wanted to comment on that, because just substitute the term male for men, and it doesn't sound like as quote unquote bigoted or whatever.
Blanchard coined the term autogynephilia, New Greek for love of oneself as a woman. It's a theory that contradicts what almost all trans women say and believe about themselves.
Notice she says almost all, but there's plenty of self-aware trans women who identify as AGPs. So it's not all trans women. It's just most, but there's a good subset of self-aware autogynephilic transsexuals, and there's more and more of them who are coming out and talking. And also, Anne Lawrence published a book, and Anne Lawrence is a transgender autogynephile researcher who like researched autogynephilia and published a book of like a qualitative research of like hundreds of stories of like I don't know if it's hundreds, but it was a lot, like of like self-identified AGPs who are transsexual. So yeah.
And affirms the common prejudice that trans people are really just sex perverts, which
Okay, so right away we see the loading of the emotional baggage, this claim that they're really just sex perverts, when Ray Blanchard talks about autogynephilia being a type of orientation. Um, it and it's a sort of and it's a paraphilic orientation. It can be a paraphilia and it can be an orientation at the same time. I know there's controversy about that, but this language of like, oh, they're just perverts. They're really just perverts. No, it's not necessarily like it's not necessarily about perversion. That is not core to the theory. It's about an internalized attraction to oneself being feminine. It is heterosexuality inverted. So, yes, there are some autogynephiles who engage in pretty deviant, kinky sex stuff, but like to sort of frame the theory as saying they're really just perverts and that explains everything. That is what's called a straw man. That is like that is not building up the strongest case for the theory, and it's really just it it's like making the theory come off as like very reductionistic and inflammatory when that's not the nature of the theory. So she's projecting in order to make it like it. So this is often how Contrapoints works. She like sort of says things in a very inflammatory way to sort of characterize the theory, and then she sets it up and then attacks it. But it's like, well, it's like easy to attack theories when you set them up in this very straw man, inflammatory way.
Okay, some of us are, but not for the reasons Blanchard said. One, just what the hell do I think I'm doing? Rest assured, in this video I am going to argue that Blanchard's theory is false, but a lot of trans women are probably nervously wondering why I'm using my platform to potentially increase awareness of a sinister fringe theory that only
Um, this whole language of like sinister fringe theory. No, it is a scientific hypothesis. It might be wrong. It might be right. Who knows? Well, let's study it scientifically. Let's do evidence. Let's do research. Like Blanchard was a researcher. He proposed a scientific hypothesis in regards to the etiological origins of gender dysphoria and male to female transsexualism. And he might be wrong about that. But to say it's like a sinister fringe theory, that's part of this whole inflammatory straw manning that Contrapoints always does. And to say it's a fringe theory, all theories start off as fringe theories. You know what also started off as a fringe theory? Special relativity, until it got proven later by experiments. Like everything starts off as a fringe theory and then it gets accepted over time. But just because something is fringe doesn't mean that it is wrong. Germ theory also used to be a fringe theory. Now it's accepted. So just painting it as a fringe theory doesn't that has no logical entailment on its truth.
adds to the stigma we all already face. After all, autogynephilia gives scientific legitimacy to our culture's most twisted misrepresentations of trans women. So it's understandable that to a lot of trans women, the prospect of this concept gaining cultural traction is pretty terrifying. However, I respond that, as one of YouTube's leading B-list transsexuals, I've had several conversations with academics and journalists where it becomes clear that they believe in Blanchard's theory, even if the cowards won't admit it to my face. So, as I see it, the damage is already done. What's needed now is an accessible, convincing refutation of the theory. I hope this video will accomplish 3 things. 1. Persuasively argue that the wrong theory is wrong. 2. Account for how a wrong theory became so influential. And 3. Move beyond some of the platitudes about trans people and open up a deeper discussion about what it really means to be transgender. Socrates, you know the drill. 2. Blanchard's typology. The mainstream scientific view, endorsed by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, the DSM-5, and most practicing clinicians, is that the primary reason trans people transition is to alleviate gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a...
Okay, so again, this is just the way she sets this up. It's like, so Blanchard's theory of autogynephilia says that autogynephilia is like when when you have AGP, it causes gender dysphoria. So you transition to relieve the you transition to relieve the dysphoria caused by the autogynephilia. So that is not that is not a contradiction to the theory to say that that transition relieves gender dysphoria. AGP explains the origins of the gender dysphoria.
State of social, emotional, anatomical, sexual, spiritual, and sartorial angst relating to one's assigned birth sex, which is mostly relieved by socially and medically transitioning to the gender of one's psychological identity. This is what motivated me to transition, and I endorse the mainstream scientific view. However,
so also the theory of autogynephilia does not say that there's only one motivating cause for why someone ultimately makes a decision to transition. So there can be other motivating factors. There can be an entire like psychological apparatus in your mind, this autobiographical self narrative identity and all this stuff, all these complex, things unique to your life and your individual case. And it can still be the case that you are of the autogynephilic type because you are um, of the heterosexual type, and and there's just certain distinctive patterns in how homosexual versus non-homosexual transsexuals manifest. Like there's just different patterns of behaviors. So you can have um, multiple complex, personal, individualistic, spiritual, psychological, whatever motivations, and you can still have AGP, this internalized attraction to oneself as being feminine. You can still have that internalized attraction as being part of the motivating causal story. It doesn't have to be the entirety of the motivating factor. Humans are very complex creatures. Humans have multiple complicated motivations. Some are unconscious, some are conscious. You can have an unconscious motivating factor from autogynephilia, and you can have conscious, reflective, self-aware, narrative reasons for why you're doing what you're doing. But that doesn't diminish the fact that there's these underlying unconscious factors that are derived from inverted heterosexuality, which is different from the way in which the homosexual type, manages or deals with their gender dysphoria. So,
sex researcher Blanchard has a different theory. According to Blanchard, trans women are driven to transition primarily by sexual motivations.
no, that's not true. It's not the case that they're driven to it primarily by sexual reasons. The theory says that the sexual reasons are part of the story. It does not have to be the primary cause. That is the fundamental the biggest straw man of the theory. I see over and over. They'll say like, "Oh, you're saying I only did this for sexual reasons, or I'm primarily doing this for sexual reasons." No, it's just that the sexual reasons are a part of your causal story, and in the homosexual type, those sexual reasons are not the same. They're not shared. So that is the core of the theory, is that the AGP is it it's like a factor. It's a disposition. It predisposes you to the development of gender dysphoria. But it's so there's this confusion that is saying that it's like the primary reason.
He didn't really bother to think about trans men or non-binary people, so you all are
So so he actually did think about trans men and non-binary people, but fundamentally, non-binary people relative to their birth sex are either homosexual or non-homosexual. So they still fall into the same motivating factors, particularly if you are male non-binary versus female non-binary. And most non-binary are female, and male sexuality and female sexuality is just they're just different. And you can have a theory that focuses on why male to female transsexualism um, exists that is different than a theory of why female to male transsexualism exists. However, Phil Illey, who wrote the book Auto Heterosexual, he's been doing a lot of work recently, showing that there's actually a sort of analogy in the female to male case called autoandrophilia. And while researchers like Ray Blanchard and Michael Bailey are skeptical about the existence of autoandrophilia and whether it's comparable to AGP, Phil Illey has actually been doing a lot of good research, building a case for the fact that there's an analogous form of autogynephilia uh, in the female to male case.
Are excused. You can just grab a beer and laugh it up. Blanchard claims that trans women can be divided into two types of men.
Two types of males, because they are male, they're biologically male, and therefore have the innate sexual differences that are intrinsic to males in virtue of just sexual dimorphism of the human species and the fact that male sexuality is different than female sexuality.
And yeah, I know, just hold your objections for the end. The first type are the homosexual transsexuals. These gay boys cannot get enough dick, and who can blame them? Essentially, the homosexual transsexuals are naturally effeminate gay men who transition because 1. Society is more accepting of them as women than as very effeminate men, and 2. Becoming women is a good sexual strategy for them since they do better as women in the heterosexual dating market than as male femmes in the mask-for-mask dominated gay scene. The second type of trans women are the autogynephilic transsexuals. These inscrutable perverts can apparently get off just by looking.
It's this inflammatory straw manning of saying that Blanchard's saying they're all just inscrutable perverts. It's like, no, that's not what the theory says. And this is why the theory is not accepted, is because it gets overblown by these people like Contrapoints, and they sort of straw man it, and they make it sound like super inflammatory and transphobic and terrible and all this stuff. And it's like, no, it's not.
In the mirror. Blanchard describes autogynephiles as straight, bi, or self-avowed asexual men. It doesn't really matter because their primary sexual orientation is misdirected inward, leading to paraphilic sexual arousal at the thought of being or becoming women, which is their true motivation to transition. Now, I'm going to argue that this theory is wrong, but first I want to acknowledge that there does seem to be some observational validity to the claim that trans women tend to fall into one of two clusters of correlated traits. I'll replace the stigmatizing terms homosexual, transsexual, and autogynephile with more neutral language. Let's say cluster A and cluster B. Cluster A trans women are mostly androphilic, that is, attracted to men. They transition relatively early in life and are very effeminate as children. Cluster B trans women are mostly gynephilic, attracted to women, transition relatively later in life, and have outwardly boyish childhoods. When I first thought about this typology, it initially seemed pretty valid.
Why did it seem initially valid? Like why is there observational validity to that typology? Because it's tracking reality. That distinction, that typology, those two distinct patterns, cluster A, cluster B, that maps onto empirical reality. That is evidence for Blanchard's theory. like the fact that she admits it right here, saying that there's validity to that observational pattern, just goes to show that she has not at all debunked autogynephilia and will never debunk autogynephilia, because she's basically lost the plot already by acknowledging observational validity to that distinction.
I went through the mental list of trans women I know and found I could pretty easily sort them. Cluster A, cluster A, cluster B, cluster B. But as I've thought about it more, it's partially unraveled. Without even leaving my circle of acquaintances, I can think of a trans woman who followed all the cluster A patterns but now dates women, and a trans woman who followed all the cluster B patterns but now exclusively dates men.
So, okay, so this is also confused because if you look into the research on pseudo bisexuality or meta attraction, you can be a autogynephile who is fundamentally gynephilic, but nevertheless You can still exclusively date men because the men um validate your femininity. They like validate your conception of yourself as a woman. Relative to the man, you feel much more feminine compared, and that is an important aspect because part of the sexuality of the AGPs is a internalized attraction to the idea of becoming feminine. And so when you're dating men, you're getting validated in your femininity because the men, and also these men, they are attracted to feminine males. And so by you know by dating men, you get your femininity validated because anyone who's trans and posted like a steamy photo somewhere knows that there's a lot of horny, quote unquote chasers, aka gynoandromorphophiles, aka men who are into she-males. They are very much into trans women. And so you get a lot of validation by dating men. And so you can be autogynephilic and exclusively date men. That is a possibility within the theoretical apparatus of the theory. So that is not a contradiction to the theory at all. And Phil Illy talks about this in his book, Auto Heterosexual. So I'd recommend checking out the book and reading about this because this is definitely a pattern. And if you don't understand the way in which pseudo bisexuality and meta attraction work, then you're going to think that there's all these counter examples when they're not actually counter examples. Um, because these trans women who are AGP who date men, they don't have the same sort of raw androphilic attraction to masculinity in the same way. It's just not the same as the way in which a gay male is just absolutely in love with mask for mask, like mask for mask, like like that's the attraction. You just have like this deep sexual arousal to masculinity, whereas that's not the case for the autogynephile, but they still are able to have satisfying sexual lives with these men, and they might be attracted to the men, but the attraction to them is sort of not quite the same. But you still find them attractive, but you don't find them attractive in the same way because it's a manifestation of the meta attraction. um and I don't know, it's like hard to explain, but like once you recognize this, um yeah. So, and as far as the other case where you have the cluster A pattern who is now dating women, um, like, yeah, like there are some AGPs who actually are very naturally effeminate as children and fall and transition early. There are some early transition AGPs, and particularly as it's become easier and easier to transition, and there's more and more awareness about trans culture, you can be AGP, and you don't have all the same cultural roadblocks in society that made it such that the older pattern was that these heterosexual males would live lives as men for um their like whole life and get married and have kids and families and be in the military, these high powered male jobs and stuff. But now in modern society, it's much easier for a young AGP to transition. So there's going to be cases where you have someone of the autogynephilic ideology who matches that traditional cluster A pattern of being effeminate and and like passes well and transitions early. But that is not a counter example to the theory.
So while I think there may really be two genuine trends here, I interpret them merely as correlation clusters that get fuzzy around the edges. Blanchard, however, takes homosexual transsexuals and autogynephiles to be two sharply distinct types, with two completely different psychosexual motivations to transition. And this
So that's not strictly true. I mean, um, I mean, It is a model. A typology is like a model. Models are always abstraction. So it's always going to be the case that a model abstracts from reality. So like and I don't think it's the case that like Blanchard makes it perfectly sharp and like black and white. And I have seen some interviews where he does acknowledge some fuzzy overlap, but the theory does not fall apart if there's a little bit of fuzziness. That does because the basic theory is validated by the general observational pattern between the two clusters, cluster A versus cluster B.
This is what I strongly disagree with. The notion that male homosexual strategy or autogynephilic lust are the primary motivations to transition. And I have a lot of backup here since trans women almost universally reject this characterization of their experience.
So the alternative explanation for why trans women universally reject this characterization of their experience is because you've described the characterization in an incredibly inflammatory and strawman way by saying that, oh, he's just a perverted fetishist or whatever. It's like if trans women heard a more neutral descriptive characterization of the phenomenon, they would be less likely to reject it because it hasn't been painted in this inflammatory light like you're doing here, Contrapoints. And the other thing is that trans women have a social motivation to reject this characterization because it makes them look bad, or they perceive that it will make them look bad in society because, it's not as socially palatable as a narrative compared to the traditional born in the wrong body narrative, which is just an easy narrative for people to tell people about like why you transitioned. So like it is not hard to imagine why a trans woman would have unconscious motivations to distort their own history, distort their self narrative, to distort their own autobiographical narrative in order to have a more socially palatable story to tell. Because we're all motivated to have socially acceptable narratives and stories and identities to give to the public when we're sort of constructing our persona and our mask that we present to the social world.
Now, you'd think that'd be a major problem for the theory, but fortunately, Blanchard has an airtight response to that, namely that trans women who disagree with him are fucking liars. I mean, that's really the scientific ideal, isn't it?
No, it's not necessarily that they are lying, because lying implies that you are intentionally misleading. Now, I do think that there are some trans women who intentionally downplay the fact that they had a fetishistic history to their to their transition, because there's a lot of trans women who talk about how sissy pornography was a pathway into their trans identification. They're probably going to downplay that and like not talk about that openly. Um, because when you talk about it openly, you talk about the true paraphilic dimensions to your transition stories, such as Andrea Long Chu, who wrote that sissy porn made her trans or whatever in one of her books or whatever. This is basically and she got socially like lambasted for that. So yeah, like but she was honest. But that's not a socially acceptable narrative to be honest about this stuff. Because so yeah.
A theory that can't be falsified.
Yes, it can totally be falsified, because it would be falsified if that general observational pattern between cluster A and cluster B did not exist. If there was not a general observational pattern of cluster A and cluster B, it would be falsified. So we do know how to falsify it in theory. In theory, you would run the original studies, and if the studies came back and they didn't show cluster A and cluster B, then it would be falsified. So this idea that it can't be falsified is totally false. It's just like made up because like if cluster A and cluster B were not these distinct patterns, then it would be falsified.
It's perfect. 3. The man who would be queen. Blanchard's theory likely would have been glanced at by a handful of sexologists before fading into the endless sea of forgotten academic publications had it not been given a major publicity boost by J. Michael Bailey, a Northwestern psychology professor who endorsed Blanchard's theory in a 2003 pop science book titled The Man Who Would Be Queen. Great cover, Bailey. Very controversial, very provocative.
I don't think he chose the cover. I mean, most authors don't choose the cover to their books. If you ever published a book, you know that authors do not create the covers for their own books. So that's not really like a good criticism.
Very politically incorrect. I have been triggered. Well done. Now, Bailey, I read your book, which, considering how much I enjoy your cream, was just amazingly bad. The Man Who Would Be Queen is a frightening book for trans women because it's acutely transphobic but also kind of vivid and well written, and it introduced a wide audience to Blanchard's typology. The first 2 parts of the book describe homosexual transsexuals, including Bailey's and his male research assistant's observations that they're super fuckable and natural-born sex workers.
I start upstairs to get the panoramic view, and I see Kim for the first time on the stairs dancing, posing. She is spectacular, exotic,
I find out later that she is from Belize.
and sexy. Her body is incredibly curvaceous,
Which is a clue that it may not be natural.
and I notice a very subtle and not unattractive angularity of the face, which is also
Not clearly diagnostic.
on this tall siren. It is difficult to avoid viewing Kim from 2 perspectives,
As a researcher, but
also as a single heterosexual man.
Wow, Bailey. Great science writing.
You already described it as pop science. It is a popular book. Scientists are allowed to be human. Scientists are allowed to describe their inner phenomenological experience. It is a popular science book. It is not a research published article in a journal or whatever. So like, and I don't know, that is, you can make anything sound weird if you do a voice like that. I mean, come on, like that's not that crazy.
When he's done drooling all over the homosexual transsexuals, Bailey moves on to the autogynephilic transsexuals, focusing almost entirely on a single case study of a trans woman he calls Cher, whose backstory is a stomach-churning nightmare of autoerotic mania and transvestic masturbation. Bailey describes how Cher made videos of herself wearing female masks and vaginal prostheses while receiving anal sex from a sex robot of her own construction, all to the accompaniment of a Donna Summer's album and the moaning audio from a porno film. It honestly sounds like something I would do in a video as a joke. So well done, Bailey. You found an honest-to-God pervert. And look, as a performance artist, I love the sex robot. I admire it. I want it in my life. But as a transsexual, I mean, Bailey, this has nothing to do with being trans.
Except for the many cases in which people describe that they're prior to transition, they have a whole history of fetishism. Also, go on Reddit, go on the sissy porn side of Reddit, femboy porn, sissy porn, trans porn, whatever. It like transgender women are this is not that crazy. So yeah.
You just found a person who built a sex robot. That's not how Bailey sees it, though. He upholds Cher as an exemplary case of an autogynephilic transsexual, claiming that Cher's sexual fetishism is typical of the motivations of all trans women who aren't exclusively attracted to men. So Bailey's telling is that autogynephiles are these unfeminine male masturbators showing up to gender clinics with bogus stories of how they always knew they were women in order to get genital reassignment surgery to satisfy their paraphilia. Now,
except it's literally the case that transgender women in their informal social circles will tell you how to spin your story in order to get your hormones and your surgeries. That is a well-documented fact in transgender lore, that there's a long history of transgender women coaching each other on exactly what to say to the therapist in order to maximize the chance of like getting past the gatekeeping system. So that is actually true.
What's striking about this to me is even for a defense of Blanchard's theory, Bailey's account is more lurid and grotesque than it needs to be. Bailey likes to think of himself as a dangerous libertine philosopher, pursuing the light of truth wherever it may lead, unrestrained by conventional morality and political correctness alike. You're so filthy. But what does the unrestrained pursuit of truth look like? What objective methodologies does Bailey employ? Well, for the most part, it seems like he just goes to gay bars in Chicago and chats up trans women, turning these stories into case studies for his book. Sounds like an awful lot of fun for scientific research. You need a research assistant.
It's a popular science book. You already said that you said that 5 minutes ago, that Michael Bailey wrote a pop science book, which is different than his actual empirical research that he publishes in peer-reviewed journals, which employs actual scientific methodology.
Assistant Bailey, the man who would be queen, is filled with sentences like,
There is no way to say this as sensitively as I would prefer, so I'll just go ahead.
all right, you edgy fuck, let's hear it.
Most homosexual transsexuals are much better looking than most autogynephilic transsexual.
We appreciate the feedback, Bailey, we really do. But is this science?
It's an observational pattern, because yes, it is the case. It is just an empirical fact of reality that for whatever reason, nature has decided to make homosexual transsexuals more naturally feminine and passable as women than the autogynephilic type. I don't know why that is, but maybe, that seems to be a fact of reality. So just saying that you don't like that, it doesn't negate its truth. Because if you look at the cluster A and the cluster B, cluster A like almost always passes like way better than cluster B. Why is that? I don't know. Maybe there's some empirical truth to nature that just made it so the case that the homosexual transsexuals are, like that's not like a scientifically impossible thing. It's not like nature would be like impossible to evolve a situation such that, the homosexual males are more effeminate in their appearance than the autogynephilic type or whatever. That's not impossible. So why is it so crazy?
Effectively a straight cis man announcing his discovery that young straight chicks are hotter than middle-aged lesbians and trying to pass it off as a valid empirical observation. And like the pop science cis-het men have written over the past century regarding the nature of females and homosexuals, their observations about trans women are seriously lacking some vital perspectives. This is what we postmodernists mean when we complain that science often privileges a white cis-het male perspective. It's not that I hate men or male sexuality,
Well, why don't you talk about Anne Lawrence, who is not a cis-het man, but is a transsexual? and Anne Lawrence published the exact same observation. So you're gonna make that criticism as like, oh, Bailey's research is invalid because he's a white cis-het man, but Anne Lawrence, the autogynephilic transsexual research, is valid because Anne Lawrence isn't cis. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Like, criticize it on the basis of the actual scientific findings and like not like whether Michael Bailey is like white and cis. That's stupid.
Hate that the male sexual perspective is so powerful that it gets to call itself science. It's not that there is no objective truth, it's that this represents a very narrow window on it. Wouldn't anyone care to hear
Why are you talking about a pop science book and not looking at the actual scientific journals and empirical research literature on this topic? Like, why focus on the pop science and not the science that the pop science is popularizing? Because what does pop science do? Pop science popularizes the science that's found in peer-reviewed journal articles. So I don't know, it's silly.
different perspective? Well, how about mine? 4. My perspective. From my perspective, Michael Bailey is a lecherous edgelord. He's a man who, when I was a student at Northwestern, was mostly famous for the fuck saw incident. Google it. Of course, that doesn't mean that the fundamental claims of his book aren't true. Even if we could prove that Bailey gets together every weekend with Blanchard to sacrifice a trans baby to Beelzebub, it would still have no bearing on the scientific correctness of the theory, which might still be true. The problem is, it isn't true, which I'll argue at length in a moment. But first, it's worth noting that the theory has gained acceptance among a non-trivial number of academics and journalists, largely because 1. It's often presented as the only supposedly scientific alternative to mushy platitudes about women born in men's bodies, and 2. Many trans women have reacted to Bailey and Blanchard with extreme vitriol and personal attacks, resulting in the widespread perception that a bunch of triggered PC cucks are throwing a narcissistic male entitlement temper tantrum because Bailey and Blanchard accurately call them out as paraphilic fetishists. In her 2015 book Galileo's Middle Finger, bioethicist Alice Drager championed Bailey as the undeserving victim of a hysterical SJW lynch mob, but she gets so caught up in exonerating Bailey of the personal accusations against him and in telling a bigger story about academic freedom and how scientists are being silenced by PC cucks that she doesn't bother to check how good Bailey's science really is, and ends up affirming the autogynephilia theory herself. Now, I'm certainly not going to deny that trans people on the internet can sometimes behave like a bit of an angry mob. In fact, I may be on the receiving end of one of those myself in about, 20 minutes, depending on how this video is received. But there's not exactly a shortage of sleazy passive aggression from the Blanchard and Bailey camp either. Blanchard is known to seek out and comment on pornography made by his detractors, and Drager is an advocate for the narcissistic rage theory of trans backlash against Bailey. Remember, according to autogynephilia theory, many trans women are erotically fixated on themselves, from which a dishonest person can make a conceptual leap to saying that they're narcissists, and hence any trans woman who raises her voice in this conversation is accused of exhibiting narcissistic rage emanating from her wounded male ego.
So the phenomenon of narcissistic rage is a well-documented empirical phenomenon in trans women. For example, we're all familiar with GameStop Ma'am, that trans woman who got misgendered or whatever, or correctly sexed as sir or whatever, and just started yelling, "It's ma'am, it's ma'am," and just got really it went like totally viral. But it's like, yeah, like that is the sort of narcissistic rage that we're talking about, or or India Willoughby on some reality TV show, yelling about I'm a real woman, I'm a real woman. It's just like, you see this all the time. So it's not that crazy to think that narcissistic rage can be triggered by a challenge to the self-construct of womanhood.
Furthermore, like so many other professors in recent academic freedom controversies, Blanchard and Bailey being ruthlessly silenced by PC cucks has not really interfered with their academic careers, nor their continued authority to misrepresent people with less power than them.
To say that it hasn't interfered with their academic careers is totally nonsense because they tried to get Michael Bailey fired for years. Of course that impacted his career.
Of course, assuming that autogynephilia really is a misrepresentation of trans women, and that's really the crux of this whole drama, isn't it? So let's just leave the drama behind and dive right into that question, pursuing the pure light of truth, as we always do on this channel, relying only on the facts, the figures, the scientific studies. Just kidding. If you really want to read a scientific argument against autogynephilia, read Julia Serrano's article, The Case Against Autogynephilia, which pretty much sums it up. Because I know that you didn't click on this video because you wanted to hear about science. You came here because you wanted filth. And I'll give you filth, Bailey. I know that's what you want. And I want to give you what you want. I want to give it all up for you. 5. The false dichotomy. Filth is coming, don't worry, but before we get there, there's one more thing we need to discuss. Advocates of Blanchard's theory pretty much unanimously introduce it as if it were the only possible alternative to what's called the feminine essence theory. The feminine essence theory says that trans women are female souls in male bodies, that we are women from birth to death, and that transition is merely an effort to make our accidental exterior match our essential interior. People like Drager will tell you that trans activists dogmatically adhere to this theory, and that anyone who challenges it will be pursued by a ruthless witch hunt. And of course, the only way to challenge it, we are told, is to defer to Blanchard's typology of homosexual and autogynephilic transsexuals. Now, I object to this framing of the discussion because I don't believe in Blanchard's typology or the feminine essence theory. There is no feminine singularity that made me a woman from birth. I wasn't born a woman. I was born a fucking baby.
No, you were born a male. You were born biologically male, And therefore, you inherited all the innate sex differences that come from the sexual dimorphism of the human species that makes males different from females. So you weren't born a baby, you were born a male baby, which is very relevant to your existence.
Just like everyone else. There's no such thing as a feminine essence or a masculine essence.
There is such thing as a male essence and a female essence, given to the fact that there are real innate sex differences between males and females. That is the essence. And it's like there are just innate sex differences between males and females in virtue of the sexual dimorphism. Just like there's innate sex differences between bulls and cows. Would we say there's no such thing as a bull essence versus a cow essence? Like, no, of course not. We would say that there's males and there's females. That's like just like all across the animal kingdom, we see these differences between males and females.
There's only biology, habitual behavior, and the way society responds to you, all of which can be changed quite a lot, and all of which are currently changing for me. Now, there is an emotional appeal to the feminine essence theory. I think most people have gender essentialist intuitions, and I admit I do feel on some level that I'm supposed to be a woman by nature. And in a sense, that may be true. I don't think I chose to be trans, and it seems likely that there's something inherent in my biology or psychology that led me to transition. But that's not quite the same thing as essential womanhood, which intellectually I don't think makes sense. I think it's heartwarming gibberish. But there is also, I think, a legitimate role in the discourse for heartwarming gibberish. Sometimes you have to explain what it means to be trans to a person who believes that dogs go to heaven. And in most circumstances, saying I'm a female soul in a male body gets the point across. Not all language is philosophical. It's a lot easier to explain what being trans is in essentialist terms. To explain it without gender essentialism, it requires a whole complicated philosophical discussion that most people simply aren't up to having. But the useful platitudes become a problem when more analytically minded people start putting these things under the microscope, and then they end up concluding that trans people are just fetishists who are telling lies about themselves.
Again, this language of like, oh, you're just a fetishist. That's not what AGP says. AGP just says that the trans women who are gynephilic, they have an internalized attraction that operates as a predisposing factor for the development of gender dysphoria. It doesn't mean you're, it's just a form. It's like a sexual orientation that's been inverted by this inversion factor or whatever. That's all it is. But to say like, oh, you're just a fetishist, no, you're not just a fetishist. It's like,
So you're probably wondering, if I'm not a fetishist and not essentially a woman, then why am I transitioning? Well, I keep saying this, but dysphoria really was the primary reason. And shortly before I transitioned, I made a whole video about that if you're curious. You have to keep in mind that transitioning is not just for the bedroom. When you decide you're going to live as a woman, you have to do that at the grocery store and on airplanes and at Thanksgiving dinner with your family, if you even still have a family. It's kind of hard for me to imagine why someone would do that just to gratify a masturbatory urge. That said,
it's not a masturbatory urge. It is a deep aspect of your sexual orientation. Just like the heterosexual man goes to Thanksgiving dinner with the woman he's dating as a result of his underlying heterosexuality. The underlying heterosexuality motivates him to go to Thanksgiving dinner with his new girlfriend or whatever to meet his girlfriend's family. So ultimately, him going to the Thanksgiving dinner is explained by the fact that he's heterosexual, but that doesn't mean that he's masturbating at Thanksgiving dinner. So, like, it's the same thing with autogynephilia. It is a underlying orientation that predisposes you to the development of, gender dysphoria. And then in response to that, you have an elaborate psychological response. And so, yeah. And like Blanchard has like acknowledged this.
is there some sexual aspect of being transgender? Well, of course there goddamn is. How could an adult decide to switch genders without there being some connection to sexuality? The problem is, autogynephilia is not a good description of that connection in most cases, and it certainly isn't in my case. But I'm a 29-year-old transsexual with a history of dating women and cross-dressing in erotic situations, no less.
Okay, so right there, we show that she admits that she's gynephilic and has a history of erotic cross-dressing. Okay, so by definition, you're AGP. That's all. That's all it is. That's all it says. And all it says is that cluster A and cluster B. In cluster B, you're going to find way more instances of the trans women having that history of erotic cross-dressing, and in cluster A, you're going to find it far, far less common to have erotic cross-dressing. That's all the distinction says. That is an empirical, valid observation of reality. That's all the theory says. It's you don't have to go any more detailed than that.
According to Blanchard's theory, I'm therefore an autogynephile. It seems that I have some explaining to do. Well, here's where the filth comes in. 6. Contrapoints, an erotic life. Come one, come all to the gender circus with your host Natalie. Step right up, you filthy freaks. One of the reasons it's difficult for trans women to refute Blanchard's theory is that even arguing against it from your own experience is incredibly humiliating and degrading and invalidating. Fortunately, I have no sense of self-respect or dignity whatsoever, so I'm willing to take one for the team here. Get your clipboards out, gentlemen. I want to make this as easy as possible for the psychoanalysts at home. I was born in 1988. As a small child, I was not especially feminine nor especially masculine. I was not interested in sports and was just kind of physically inept. My main childhood interest was music, and I learned several instruments. In early adolescence, I was misdiagnosed with OCD, the primary symptoms being spending too much time in the shower and spending too much time styling my hair. My sexual development was kind of late. I never masturbated till I was 15. And I didn't fantasize about having sex with women or with men or even about becoming a woman. My fantasies were kind of platonic almost. I would sort of fantasize about women, but in a very abstract kind of way. An early romantic disappointment involved my realization that women would never be attracted to me in the same way that I was attracted to them. In my late teens and early 20s, I was a long-haired, smooth-chested androgyne, which suited me well. It was around then that I first cross-dressed, when a woman I was seeing asked if she could dress me up in her clothes and do my makeup. God, yes, I said. Throughout my 20s, I was on and
The fact that she said God yes is a good indicator of autogynephilia. Whereas that's probably like an instant boner right there. But the homosexual type doesn't have that sort of like God yes desire, that arousal component to the idea of being erotically feminized or cross-dressed or whatever.
off in relationships where there was this feminization dynamic. More women are into feminizing boys than you might think. When I was feminized, we would just make out and not do anything penetrative, but just sort of little proto-lesbian things, you know? Now, some women I was with were not into that, and some would practically lock their underwear drawers when they found out I had done it in the past. There was one period where I cut my hair short and quit that altogether, but it didn't last more than a couple years. When I had regular heterosexual sex, it was like my soul had to leave my body in order for me to get the poison out, which is how I thought of it. The cross-dressing was never a solo or a masturbatory activity. There was always a partner, or sometimes several partners.
So that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't fit into the autogynephilic typology, because this, like, having a erotic interest in being feminized in the bedroom by women is like, that's a classic AGP. And so AGP is an incredibly diverse phenomenon. So yes, you're going to have some people doing like, sex robots and, all this stuff. So everyone's autogynephilia manifests very differently. And there's all those different types of AGP. And depending on your libido as a young boy and all these things. So there's going to be very complicated presentations of this. And so we can't expect that everyone's going to have like the sex robot story. Some people are going to have stories where they're like, they never masturbated, or but it's the core aspect of having that erotic interest in feminization. Whereas in the homosexual type, you don't see that. It's just not there in the same way.
Bailey, are you paying attention to this? This is for you. What I liked about it was the way that dressing like a woman changed the way partners interacted with my body, how they would kind of treat me like a woman. I fully
That is a type of autogynephilia called um, uh, interpersonal autogynephilia. I think that's what it is. It's like you're erotically attracted to the idea of being treated like a woman. That's like classic. That's like classic AGP.
acknowledge that a lot of the feminization was pretty fetishistic. There was a lot of short dresses and thigh highs, and occasionally also a BDSM submissive aspect. But over time, I realized that the fetish aspect wasn't really what I liked about it. It wasn't humiliating for me to be feminized. It was a
Not all AGP has to be in terms of humiliation, because this is the thing. She's trying to characterize it as that, oh, it's all about fetish and kink and paraphilia, but it's better categorized as a inverted heterosexuality that can manifest in very diverse forms. So it is a type of sexual orientation, really. So it's not, so to connect it to being a fetish, it's just not the same thing. And it's really a paraphilia. And what is a paraphilia? A paraphilia is an unusual sexual orientation. That's all it is. Um,
affirming. And one day I kind of realized that I didn't want to be feminized at all. I wanted to be feminine. In my mid
so this is classic AGP, because AGP is progressive. It starts off as a little seed, and then it grows, and then it grows, and then it grows, and then like you want to embody, um, you know, your sexuality all the time. And the analogy I have is like, suppose you are homosexual, you're like a gay guy, and um, you know, you have like one experience with like a man sexually, and that is like really great. You loved it. Um, but like, let's say that was like your only experience within 5 years. Like, well, you're like going to be motivated to have your sexuality be a part of your life all the time. Like if you're gay, you probably don't just want to have like one hookup in your life. You want to fully live the lifestyle in terms of satisfying your sexuality by, dating and romance and getting married and, spending time in the community, like all these things. Like y- you want to actualize your sexuality, just like heterosexuals also want to actualize their sexuality and, have women be a part of their life all the time, which is why you're motivated to, seek out marriage and romance and like have sex all the time. And like your sexuality becomes a full-blown part of your life. There's no such thing as being like partly heterosexual or like partly gay. So it's the same thing with AGP. If AGP is your sexual orientation, then you want to make that part of your life all the time, which is why AGP has a progressive nature. Once you get a little taste of it, it's like, no, I don't just want to taste. I want this all the time. Just like if a heterosexual man has a taste of having sex with women, he doesn't want that to make like a one-time thing. He wants to do that all the time. Once you get a taste of satisfying your sexuality, you want to do it all the time.
mid 20s, I first started really paying attention to trans women and thinking about transitioning myself. But I thought that since I didn't feel like a woman, that I never would. And I thought that I would never pass and that I would just be a hideous parody of womanhood. Then, about a year ago, thanks to this amazing online queer community that we have now, I started developing more positive thinking about this. I've always looked a little bit younger than my age, but last year I also started noticing the first signs that I was going to age into the body of an older man, and that triggered really intense gender dysphoria. At the same time, I realized that I would have to transition to have any hope of a genuinely fulfilling.
That's very common for autogynephiles to have a fear of masculinization, because it goes counter to their sexual interest in having internalized attraction to feminization. So it's like it's like a heterosexual, a man who's like a masculine heterosexual man, um and being a masculine heterosexual man is a key to his sexual success, and then he suddenly fears, let's say you like got older, and like as you got older you become less and less masculine or whatever, like, yeah, you have a fear of that because it goes against your sexuality. And so it's common for AGPs to really fear, being masculine, going bald, aging, being male. It just doesn't fit with their sexual orientation, because their sexual orientation is to be feminine. So yeah.
Sex life. And at that point, the need to transition felt so urgent that I could not wait. So I got internet hormones from the Republic of Vanuatu, and I started taking those in August until I could get a prescription from an informed consent clinic. And since then, my life has drastically changed. I live as a woman full time now, and most of the changes aren't sexual, but the hormones certainly do have sexual effects. I now find myself attracted to both women and men, and the mere visual image of a woman no longer turns me on the way it did. Instead, I need there to be a certain kind of interpersonal connection. I don't masturbate at all, and I haven't come in months. Someone, please fuck me. I guess
So this is a common thing that AGPs say. It's like, well, once I transitioned, like I stopped being so sexual, and like I don't masturbate anymore, and I'm not horny all the time. And I don't have the same like fetishistic kinks as I once did prior to transition. So therefore AGP can't be true. It's like, no. Like a lot of AGP, in terms of its intensity, in terms of that erotic drive to feminize yourself, derives from the power of testosterone impacting the male libido. And so going on the hormones castrates your sexuality, nukes your libido, and then therefore, as a result of that, it can diminish the sort of paraphilic dimensions of that, and it becomes more attuned to a romantic idealization of womanhood. But the point is not that the fetishistic components stay the same over the course of your lifetime. It's more about what is the origins, and the fact that the homosexual type do not have this history of erotic interest in cross-dressing.
the critical thing is that I've been wearing women's clothes, my clothes, for 7 consecutive months, and I have been turned on by it for 0% of the time. So the idea
But the key point is that you used to be turned on by that.
that I'm some kind of transvestic fetishist is ridiculous.
The idea is that you used to be a transvestic fetishist, and the other point is that the homosexual types are far, far, far less likely to have that history of transvestic fetishism, or to have any aspect of eroticism and arousal at the idea of being feminine. So that is the point. The theory of autogynephilia does not say that you are this highly sexual being for your entire life, because once you go into transition, your whole psychology changes, mostly due to the fact that the hormones are nuking your libido.
And I'm not turned on by the mere idea of having a female body either.
But you used to be.
I mean, when there's developments, I'll check it out, but I'm not like, oh yeah, I have tits now. That's so hot. I mean, it's kind of hot, but it's more about other people being into it than it is about me being in.
So autogynephilia, a core aspect of autogynephilia is about being perceived as feminine. And like that social aspect of like how you're perceived by others can be a dominant and core aspect of autogynephilia.
To it. So, as always, my sex drive is directed outward at other people. The sexual aspect of my transsexuality is not about the target of lust being directed inward. It's about me wanting my sexual encounters to occur from the standpoint of a female body. Or
that is a type of inward directedness, because the inward directedness is you're attracted to femininity, but you want to be feminine. So your gynephilia has become inverted, such that you want yourself to be the thing that you're attracted to, which is feminine, which is why you have a history of being into feminization kink. Why feminization was so erotic to you? It's because you have this internalized attraction to being feminine.
At least as close as I can get. And since I started hormones, it's about my sexual desires coming from this psychologically female place of vague bisexual interest activated by interpersonal connection rather than intense object-oriented male lust. So that's my attempt to describe my sexual history without resorting to politically correct cuckoldry or trans ideology. Now, I've read enough Blanchard to know that this description in no way lets me off the hook for autogynephilia. In fact, I'm what Blanchard would call a classic case of pseudo-bisexual behavioral autogynephilia. Pseudo-bisexual because, of course, all trans women's experiences are lies, and because, according to Blanchard, I only like guys because being filled up with their dicks makes me feel like a girl, which is what I'm really into. And behavioral because Blanchard describes different kinds of autogynephilia, like anatomic, transvestic, behavioral, and physiological, according to what you supposedly fetishize. And I'm turned on by sexually behaving like a woman, rather than simply wearing female clothes or having female anatomy. And I mean, okay, you can slap a Greek word on anything and make it sound scary, fake, and pathological, but I think this is an especially unfair way to characterize my experience, and here's why. 7. Autophilia in general. I'm guessing that most people would be pretty reluctant to admit that they take any kind of sexual interest in their own bodies. It's sort of like admitting that you enjoy your own body odor. Ew. But how unusual is it to check yourself out, to take some sexual interest in the sight or touch of your own body? I've noticed that cis men seem to really like their own penises and taking pictures of their penises and sending them to other people. Does that make them autoandrophiles? Are they behavioral autophallophiles? I can make up Greek words too, Blanchard. I know a cis woman who, having just bought some expensive lingerie, told me, "It's not for men, it's for me." What does that mean? It means she enjoyed wearing sexy lingerie under her clothes because it made her feel hot. Is that cisvestic autogynephilia?
No, because females are already female. They're not fantasizing about transforming into something else. If you are a female, like, yeah, you can look in the mirror and see yourself wearing fancy lingerie, and you might find that's like hot or whatever. But AGP goes far beyond that. It's very common for AGPs to get turned on by incredibly mundane things like shaving your legs or putting on underwear or putting on your makeup or painting your nails or all these things that are incredibly common, or like putting on a pair of pantyhose or something. Like all these things that are incredibly common and mundane for females. It's just not the same. And so a female who looks in the mirror and says, "Oh wow, I'm hot," that is not the equivalent of a male fantasizing about transforming into something that he is not. So the male is fantasizing about becoming female. That is not the same thing, because as the female already being female, and I think to say that the female is saying like, "Oh, I'm only doing this for me," that is just a confabulation. It is very possible for humans to not have good insight into the underlying psychological motivations of their own behavior. It is very common for the reasons that we give to describe our behavior to be post hoc rationalizations of a more underlying unconscious and emotional motivating factor. So it could be the case that she buys the sexy lingerie in order to fulfill her own heterosexual motivations to be sexy for men, and that the yeah. So we have to take that with a grain of salt.
Likewise, I used to date cis women. I know what they do, and I can tell you that women touching their own breasts during sex or while masturbating is not at all uncommon.
That's so stupid. When a woman touches her breast during sex, it feels good because it's an erogenous zone. It has sexual stimulation. It's like that is not the same thing as a male who doesn't have breasts getting aroused at the idea of wanting breast, or the idea of getting aroused by putting on breast forms or putting on a bra or whatever. That's just like not the same. This is not the same at all.
Is that anatomical autogynephilia?
No, because autogynephilia is a description of males who have an internalized attraction to femininity. Females don't have an internalized heterosexuality, because autogynephilia is heterosexuality inverted. When a female, like, so yeah, I mean, there like are, a like lesbian or homosexual females, they can be gynophilic. So it's possible for a lesbian in theory to have an inverted gynophilia or whatever, but it just usually, you just don't see that. And it's just not really the same as like males having this internalized attraction.
Twitter user Nathan of Oz pointed out that in the October 2017 issue of Cosmo, an article on self-love tips recommends that its apparently cis female readers try stroking their own feet or running a feather over their skin as a prelude to kneeling in front of a full-length mirror and rubbing one out, possibly while squatting on a dildo. Can you imagine the level of paraphilic male fetishism that would be read into this if it was written by a trans woman? I mean, it's one step away.
So a man masturbating in front of the mirror is not the same as a man masturbating in front of the mirror while fantasizing about transforming into a female. Like those are two different things. And similarly, a female masturbating in front of the mirror, um, that's not the same thing as a male fantasizing about becoming a woman. It's just not. It's just not. And to say
From filming yourself fucking a sex robot. And
to say that's anywhere close to the sorts of like paraphilic behaviors of like sissy fetishists, like it's just ludicrous.
okay, Cosmo's sex advice is often ludicrous, but the point is, it seems like it's only when it comes to trans women that we feel the need to whip out the suffix philia. It seems what's going on here is a lot of pathologizing of normal female sexuality when it exists in trans women.
Because trans women are not female. That's the whole point. The trans women are male and they have male sexuality, and therefore male heterosexuality that has been inverted is not the same thing as female sexuality, particularly heterosexual female activity. It's just the like underlying psychology is just like not the same. It's just not equivalent.
But of course, that raises the question, what is normal female sexuality? 8. Normal female sexuality. Switching from male to female hormones causes your sex drive to be completely obliterated and then regrown in new form, which came as more of a relief to me than I expected. I don't think I realized the extent to which my own sexuality felt like a demonic possession or alien infection until I was free of it.
So that demonic possession or alien infection is due to the fact that male sexuality is often more intense. It is more paraphilic. It is more rigid. It is more like, and that is a function of testosterone. Also, like male sexuality is influenced by testosterone, which is why male and female sexuality is different, and particularly if you have this innate sex difference and you go through puberty as a male.
God. When I had male hormones in me, I needed to have an orgasm like every day. I was turned on mainly by visual arousal cues. I was at a Kinsey 1 relative to my birth sex, and I had a couple mild, typical, straight guy paraphilic kinks. No, not autogynephilia. On female hormones, I initially had no sex drive at all, but have started developing very different patterns of arousal. For instance, I never need to have an orgasm. I'm turned on mainly by interpersonal cues like intimate physical contact or close emotional moments. I'm at around a 70-30 attraction to women versus men, and the paraphilic kinks have vanished without a trace. Oh, by the way, for the
That is due to the fact that you no longer have testosterone in your body.
pharmacologists at home, this is 6 milligrams estradiol and 200 milligrams spironolactone daily. So my interpretation of all this is that I have what is a pretty typical female sexuality, at least for a girl who's into girls. I don't feel like I have some essentially male pseudo-bisexual behavioral autogynephilia. One of the reasons why Blanchard has
But you did have it when you had an erotic interest in feminization. That's the thing, is like, these trans women are so focused on like their current life as transsexuals, transitioned post hormones, post transition, and they're not thinking about the theory is really speaking to the pre-transition like patterns. That is what the theory is about.
has to come up with elaborate terminology like this is he takes as foundational the presupposition that trans women are psychologically more like cis men than cis women. His studies therefore lack a
Well, duh, because they're male. That's why they're male.
cis female control group, meaning he didn't bother to apply his autogynephilia survey to cis women. But if he had, as Charles Moser did in 2009, he might have found that many of them were classified as autogynephilic. Blanchard's insistence on
That Moser study, one was based on like 23 females, or it's like it's a very small sample, and also the scale that was used to measure autogynephilia in those females was not the same scale that was given in the original Blanchard studies, because Moser had to modify the scale for it to make sense for females, because like male autogynephilia is just different. It's just fundamentally different. And the sort of questions that the Moser study females answered the highest rating on in terms of like whether they felt arousal feminizing themselves or whatever, um, it was their highest responses was in the context of getting ready for a date. So it has to do with, yes, they experience arousal, like putting on lingerie, but that's because they're getting ready for a date. It's related to their sexuality, their interest in men, whereas the autogynephile, it's not necessarily always connected to that, getting ready for a date. It's more internally oriented. It's like sort of self-contained. And yeah, so that Moser study is just not analogous to, and it doesn't show that females have autogynephilia, because the measurement scale was just totally different. So it's not comparable at all.
classifying trans women's sexuality as a variant on male sexuality makes it seem paraphilic and unusual that trans women want to have sex as women. But what do cis women want to have sex as?
It is unusual for males to want to feminize themselves due to an internalized attraction to being feminine. That is very rare for males.
As walruses? I mean, no judgments. This also explains his claim that non-exclusively androphilic trans women are pseudo-bisexual, because their attraction to men does not resemble gay male attraction to men. The idea is that these trans women's attraction to men is not based on raw physical lust, so it is therefore unlike gay male attraction to men, and is therefore pseudo. That is, it's really an autogynephilic fantasy where the man is just a prop. But what about straight cis women's attraction to men? Is that based on raw physical lust for the male body? I mean, sometimes it probably is, and I'm not a cis woman, so I can't really say. But I kind of suspect that cis female heterosexuality is not best described as raw physical lust for the male body. That is, I suspect it's quite different from cis male homosexuality, if I may risk painting with broad strokes. Take the case of Playgirl magazine, which at its peak published feminist articles alongside naked hunks but never had the circulation of its male counterpart, and later on ended up just being read by gay men. From the perspective of female sexuality, I mean, men's bodies are nice, they have great hands, great abs, great this part, it's all great. but it's not that great. And if you read pornography written by women and notice that it's usually written and not photographed, you don't find a predominant focus on vivid descriptions of male bodies. Like in 50 Shades of Grey, which I read for research purposes, there's some description of Christian's hot bod and his hot abs, but it's not the main thing by any means. There's a lot more sentences like, to the right is an imposing U-shaped sofa that could seat 10 adults comfortably.
Okay, so this idea that Contrapoints is trying to argue that like, oh, like females, like a normal heterosexual female doesn't have raw physical attraction to the male body in the same way that the gay males do. It's just like we have to frame this in the context of a little bit of evolutionary psychology, a little bit of red pill psychology here, because um, the women who are having the as as like Rollo Tomasi would say in the red pill, the women who have the hot sex in the foam party with the pool boy or whatever, or like the hot sex, that they are interested, they are attracted to that raw physical form. They are deeply attracted to the raw physical form, but they just but they also have this other side of themselves, which is like when they get older and they need that secure a provider, so they have a form of sexuality that's attracted to the alpha or whatever you want to call it. And then there's sort of the other side of things, which is what you're attracted to men and on the basis of the need for their provision, so social power, wealth, status, all these things, which is why, a ugly man who's really wealthy can get super hot babes. It's not because they're attracted to his raw physical male form, but those same women are might have an affair with a super hot guy just to hook up, but that's not the person that they're going to settle down with to get provision to raise their children. But to say that like a normal heterosexual female isn't like have like raw physical attraction to like the male body, that's like completely ludicrous. And it's like only the fact that Contrapoints can't wrap her mind around that, because she's a pseudo bisexual gynephilic AGP. So yeah, like she doesn't have that same raw physical attraction in the same way. But I don't know. So that's sort of my take is and also from talking with women and just like listening to women, like yeah, when I'm around females, like adult females talking about, men, they are often saying like, that guy's so hot, or he's so hot, or like that celebrity is hot, or just look at how many women lust over Jason Momoa, or how many women lust over, I don't know, that like Magic Mike guy or whatever. Like there's plenty of women lusting over the male body. So yeah.
It faces a state-of-the-art stainless steel, or maybe platinum for all I know, modern fireplace. Near the kitchen area, in front of the glass wall, is a dining table surrounded by 16 chairs, and tucked in the corner is a full-sized, shiny black grand piano. Here, he hands me a glass of wine. Even the glasses are rich. Heavy, contemporary crystal. It's like a Crate and Barrel catalog. I'm getting so wet. Christian is established as a man of good taste, as evinced by his contemporary crystal, his playing Bach at the piano, and that's hot because it's sexy to be wanted by someone who's qualified. It's not enough to be whistled at by a catcaller. They have no discernment. I mean, they whistle at anything that looks vaguely female. They whistle at me. And I don't want to be whistled at by the kind of person who would whistle at me. You want to be wanted by someone who, with their exquisite and discriminating taste, selects you, the protagonist. This is not a story about Christian's rippling abs and his tight buns. It's not a story about wanting a man. It's a story about...
Yes, but when a heterosexual female is having sex with a man that she finds physically attractive, the sort of hot alpha type, the like dominant type, in that moment when she's having sex, she is having raw physical lust to the chest hair, to the abs, to the muscles, to all this stuff, like the beard, the musk, the smell of the musk, that raw man scent, all that stuff is deeply attractive to heterosexual females. And so while yes, they might also be attracted to power and status and wealth and these successful men, that doesn't mean they don't also have, in the moment where they're having that hot sex with the hot guy, but like according to the statistics of like dating apps like Tinder and stuff, like um the, the vast majority of women only find like 20% of guys like hot enough to like match on or whatever. But the guys that they do match on, they're definitely experiencing that raw physical lust for them, particularly when they're younger and they're just like having sex, which is different than a woman who's in her 30s looking to settle down and find a man who can provide for her children or whatever. So you have to think about these different phases of sexuality in a woman's life, and these sort of party years where they're having sex with hot guys is much different than when you're in your 30s and you're, like a single mom looking for a man to provide for your children or whatever. But you become a single mom by having sex with the hot guys that you're physically lusting after.
Of being wanted by a man. This is how the whole romance genre works. You emotionally identify with the female protagonist, then you meet the sexy bad boy who's like a pirate or the CEO of Business Incorporated, and then the hot part is just how badly this guy wants you, the protagonist, usually singling her out over other more qualified women, and eventually giving up everything he loves to settle down and make babies with her. And a lot of these stories are kind of silly. They conflate female sexuality with women's economic dependence on men in a way that's really problematic. But I fundamentally resonate with the wish to be wanted. I want other people to think I'm sexy and want to fuck me, It makes me feel like I have value, and it fills up the void inside. Is that so wrong? 9. Female vanity. The art critic John Berger wrote in his book Ways of Seeing about the European oil painting trope of depicting a nude woman with a mirror and calling the painting vanity. The mirror was often used as a symbol of the vanity of woman. The moralizing, however, was mostly hypocritical. You painted a naked woman because you enjoyed looking at her. You put a mirror in her hand and you called the painting vanity, thus morally condemning the woman whose nakedness you had depicted for your own pleasure. The real function of the mirror was otherwise. It was to make the woman connive in treating herself as, first and foremost, a sight. The notion of the vanity of woman is a misogynistic trope that originates in male projection. It is the assumption that women enjoy looking at themselves in the same way that men enjoy looking at them, and are hence complicit in their own objectification. I think the concept of the autogynephilic transsexual woman is a combination of this trope with a homophobic trope. Misogyny casts women as narcissistic, vain, in love with themselves, and homophobia casts queer men as hypersexual perverts. The autogynephile is the ultimate combination of the two.
Many homosexual men actually are hypersexual. Like that's like not. I mean, yeah, it's a stereotype, but it's kind of based on reality to some extent. Like, just look on Grindr. I mean, come on.
The hypersexual pervert vainly in love with the image of himself as a woman. 10. Autogynephilia acceptance. So this whole video I've been treating autogynephilia kind of like an accusation from which I have to exonerate myself. And I think it's justifiable considering I'm objecting to misrepresentation. But some people might wonder, isn't this whole conversation getting kind of kink-shamey? Like, is autogynephilia so wrong? Well, no, it's not. It's fine. There definitely are men who get turned on by wearing women's clothes or thinking about having a female body. And as paraphilias go, this is very harmless, and I don't think it's...
And a lot of those men end up transitioning, or they go on Reddit and they're like, oh, is it just a fetish? Then they end up transitioning because Reddit tells them, oh, you're actually a trans woman. That's super common, because it is super common. Because when you go to a Reddit and you type in, is it just a fetish? You'll literally see hundreds of threads and posts like asking that question, is it just a fetish? And and then everyone's saying, no, you're actually trans. That's super common. Like almost every trans woman has asked the question, is it just a fetish? If you go into the Gender Dysphoria Bible, which is a super common, popular resource for trans people and trans women, there's a whole section devoted to the question of, is it just a fetish? And there's many essays, circulating around about like whether it's just a fetish. So clearly, most trans women have thought about this question of, is it just a fetish? So
anything to be ashamed of. But the question of whether genuinely autogynephilic trans women exist is more complicated. The reason most trans women consider the label autogynephilia to be such a stigma is that, as Blanchard says, women do not get turned on merely by the thought of being women. Now, as I've discussed, the problem with Blanchard...
It's because you're not turned on by the thought of acknowledging the reality of what you already are. Whereas male autogynephilia is being turned on by the thought of imagining something, of imagining yourself as something that you are not. That is the key difference.
Is he overextends the concept of autogynephilia to cover pretty much any sexual feeling a cluster B trans woman can have. But I'm actually inclined to agree with him that being turned on merely by the thought of being a woman is a fundamentally non-female state of mind, and one that feels quite foreign to me. So a lot of trans women, I guess including...
It didn't feel foreign to you when you were having those erotic feminization BDSM sessions prior to transition. Now it feels foreign to you because you're post transition and you nuked your libido with hormones. But that doesn't mean that you didn't have that history. And also, it's the case that the homosexual transsexuals don't have that history.
Me have the idea that you can't be both a woman and an autogynephile, hence the offense we take to being characterized in this way. However, things get messier when you look into this some more. Are there some genuinely autogynephilic transsexuals? Well, at first glance, the answer is yes. I mean, there's always one, isn't there? In this case, that one is Anne Lawrence, a disciple of Blanchard and self-identified autogynephilic transsexual. From 1998 to 2011, Lawrence collected 249 anonymous accounts of autogynephilia over the internet and published them in her 2012 book, Men Trapped in Men's Bodies. Great title, Anne. Very provocative, very controversial, very politically incorrect. I have been triggered. Well done. What is this cover, though? Come on, Anne. Get a statue of Hermaphroditus or something on there. So this book is filled with stories of trans women who have a past or present of pretty autogynephilia-like fantasy and behavior. So what do we make of that? Well, a lot of this stuff, like fantasies of being women or having sex as women or arousal during cross-dressing, are what the trans community has destigmatizingly termed cross-sex gender fantasy. And among trans women,
they also call them euphoria boners.
Particularly prior to transition, this kind of thing is pretty common.
It's pretty common among the gynephilic type. It is not pretty common among the homosexual type. That is the key empirical observable pattern of cluster A and cluster B. And that is why the Blanchardian typology has not been falsified. And it could be falsified if that empirical pattern was different, but it's not. That is the pattern.
See it all over the place on trans subreddits. There's a blog called Cross Dreamers devoted to it. It's been written about by Zinnia Jones and Julia Serrano. So within the trans community, this isn't even controversial. It's not provocative. It's not politically incorrect. But how do we make sense of this? Well, my thinking is that it's pretty hard to experience genuine female sexuality when you've still got the evil magic of testosterone in your system. So you've got to get that out, and then this paraphilic stuff tends to go away.
But that paraphilic stuff does not exist in the homosexual transsexual type. That is the whole point of the typology. Is this paraphilic stuff is not just like universal to like trans women, or just like randomly impacts some trans women, but randomly doesn't impact some other trans women. It impacts the trans women who are gynephilic. It does not, you don't see this paraphilic stuff in the homosexual type. That is the key distinction.
But how is this any different from Blanchard's theory of autogynephilia? Well, basically it comes down to this. Blanchard's theory claims that cross-sex gender fantasy or arousal is causal and essential. In this theory, if you're an autogynephilic transsexual, you are essentially male.
But whether you are essentially male or not is just a fact of biological reality insofar as mammals can't change sex. Whether you're male or female is dependent on your body's developmental pathway it went down uh, for the production of gametes, either large gametes or small gametes, and like having your body organized around that developmental pathway to lead to the production under normal circumstances of small gametes versus large gametes. And you can't change that. Like, we're not clownfish, and mammals and humans, you can't change that. So if you are born male, you are essentially male, and therefore you inherit all the innate sex differences of males.
Any facsimile of womanhood you achieve can only be honestly understood as the expression of an essentially male sexual urge. I reject the idea that it's causal or essential, and I think the strongest piece of evidence that it isn't essential is that even the rare trans women who identify as autogynephilic admit that after transition, the cross-sex fantasy and arousal vanishes, yet they continue to prefer living as trans women. Blanchard made
So Anne Lawrence talks about this in terms of having a erotic aspect to loving oneself as a woman and also a romantic side to loving oneself as a woman. So it's becoming what you love. So autogynephilia has both a erotic side and a romantic side. Prior to transition, it's mostly on the erotic side, but then it switches to the romantic side. But that doesn't negate the theory itself.
this observation himself.
Any viable theory relating to the etiologies of autogynephilia and transsexualism must explain the following well-established observation. Gender dysphoria in young non-homosexual males usually appears along with or subsequent to autogynephilia. In later years, however, autogynephilic sexual arousal may diminish or disappear, while the transsexual wish remains or grows even stronger. The same conclusion is suggested by the fact that surgical castration and estrogen treatment, which decrease libido in gender dysphorics as in other men, usually have no effect on the desire to live as female or the resolve to remain in that role.
If these trans women are essentially men with a paraphilic desire to become women, why would they continue preferring to live as women after the paraphilic desires go away? Well, this is where things get really weird. According to Blanchard and Lawrence, the only way to explain this is to shift the goalpost and say that actually autogynephilia isn't a paraphilia at all. It's actually a sexual orientation. So
How is that shifting the goalpost and not just like elaborating the theory to make it better, which is how all science is done? All science changes based on new information, new discoveries, new research, like a theory. Just because a theory changes and modifies itself doesn't mean it's like somehow unscientific. That's not shifting the goalpost. That's just like doing regular science.
happens when you transition is you actually pair bond with yourself, forming a kind of stale, sexless marriage with the woman you've become. And if that sounds like it doesn't make any goddamn sense at all, it's because it doesn't.
Well, it also doesn't make sense of the, you know, the theory you proposed, which you didn't propose the theory. You just said it's like gender dysphoria, which doesn't explain anything.
Pair bond is a social relationship between two or more people. Are you saying that trans women are a man and a woman inside this?
It's a metaphor. It is just a metaphor. It is just a metaphor. Metaphors don't have to be perfectly accurate to be useful and sort of having a you know like a applicable model. So yeah, that's just kind of ridiculous. It's just a metaphor to help you think about it, but it's really an internalized attraction. That internalized attraction, insofar as it's an inverted sexual orientation, it can have different manifestations. But um, so if you are a homosexual man and you somehow got in like an accident and you lost your testicles, you probably would no longer feel a lot of the same like erotic urges and of being gay, but you wouldn't stop being gay, and you might still be interested in like being married in a romantic way to a man, but you just wouldn't be very sexual. Well, it's no different with autogynephilia as far as like you still want to live out your sexuality, regardless of like whether you're super horny or not.
Why do they continue falling in love with other people? I can't even start with this. This video is too long. I'm getting cranky. Look, this seems like the point where Occam's razor shuts down Blanchard's theory. Like, okay, maybe I subconsciously created a female alter ego with which my original male ego has fallen in love. But maybe lots of things. Maybe I subconsciously want to become my mother so I can fuck my father. Maybe the elder gods ripped my primordial duality in twain, and now I'm yearning for my female half. Or maybe I'm just a woman who wants someone to fuck me every once in a while.
Maybe you're just a male who had a history of erotic feminization fantasies and BDSM scenes and having classic behavioral interpersonal autogynephilia, who then had that sexual orientation, developed gender dysphoria, and then you transition in order to to treat that. And now that you've treated that, you're managing your sexual orientation in a way, and you're living out your sexuality. Because your fundamental desire to be feminine based on that internalized attraction to feminizing yourself has become manifested in reality, and that makes you happy. So yeah, maybe that's the better answer.
11. True autogynephiles. Among the narratives recorded in Lawrence's book, there are admittedly a few accounts of trans women whose primary sexuality and motivation throughout their transition does appear to be genuinely autogynephilic. And I'm not going to say that these people are lying about their experiences, because that would be a terrible thing to do. Ultimately, Contrapoints is not a channel about judging people, so I'm not going to say that these people aren't really trans. I mean, I find it weird and hard to imagine, but whatever. I'm the one who's into people licking milk off my tits. And wait till you see my sex robot. And look, if I had autogynephilic feelings, I would just tell you. I've already admitted to things in this video that I wouldn't tell my own diary.
You already said you had autogynephilic feelings by describing your history of arousal and sexual interest and erotic feminization. So you've already said it. That's all you need to say. It's just about a history. It doesn't mean that currently describes your current sex life, because you said you don't masturbate, you don't have libido, and you're not horny. But it's that doesn't impact your past. Autogynephilia is about the history. It's about the etiology, the origins of things.
On my deathbed, but I just don't. This theory doesn't describe my conscious motivations to transition.
Well, just because it doesn't describe your conscious motivations to transition doesn't mean it doesn't describe your unconscious motivations to transition, which you don't have conscious access to.
And that's ultimately the reason most trans women hate this theory, not because of wounded narcissism or shattered erotic delusions. We just don't like being misrepresented. But you know who does love this theory? She's been there literally the whole time. You know, I realize that by talking about this, I'm subjecting myself to a lot of ruthless psychoanalysis, whether it's going to come from TERF Reddit or trans people who are mad at me for even talking about this, or who knows, maybe even Blanchard and Bailey themselves. So you know what? Why don't we just get that out of the way right now? It's time to put this tranny on trial. 12. The Autogynephilia Trial of Contrapoints. All rise. The Autogynephilia Department of the Sexology Court is now in session. Judge Bailey presiding. Calling the case of the gender-critical subreddit versus Contrapoints. Are both sides ready? District Attorney Cockbean, ready for the subreddit, Your Honor. Ready, I guess. Your Honor, ladies of the subreddit, the defendant is a man. A full-grown, 6-foot, wide-shouldered man in a dress. It's really more of a hospital gown. The evidence will show that the defendant is not a woman, but a male pervert role-playing as such for his own twisted sexual amusement. Abigail, what are you holding? It's for horseback riding. Your Honor, I would like to admit into evidence the following video clip, uploaded to YouTube by the defendant on June 13th, 2016. Oh God. Fishnets, garter belts, corsets. If these are not the trappings of an autogynephile, then I don't have 2 X chromosomes. Agreed. Well.
See, that's the thing is Contrapoints is too smart to to say that the theory has no validity at all. I mean, she clearly recognizes that she falls into the autogynephilic type. She recognizes that she has a history of erotic interest and cross-dressing and feminization and all this stuff. It's very, very prototypical, very classical. But she also knows that she has a whole audience of trans people who would totally cancel her if she said that autogynephilia is like true. So, given audience capture, can we really say, in all honesty, that that Contrapoints felt no social pressure from the trans community to have a pre-established judgment on this theory that the theory is false? Because if she had come out and said that there's more validity to this theory than falsehood, she would have been totally canceled, just in the same way that Bailey got canceled and all these other people got canceled. So yeah.
What do you have to say for yourself? Well, why do you think I had all that fetish stuff in the first place? The court does not need to hear about your perverse masturbation rituals. I bought that stuff for Rocky Horror. What? Rocky Horror Picture Show. I used to do Frankenfurter. Your Honor, I'd like to admit into evidence the following photograph. That's me at E Street Cinema in 2014. This one's on the house key.
So yeah, that's pretty classic AGP. I mean, come on.
Kiwi Farms. Are you a Rocky Horror fan, Your Honor? Am I? It's just a jump to the left. And take a step to the right. Put your hands on your hips. And bring your knees in tight. But it's the pelvic thrust. Ew. So you liked to dress up as another cross-dressing autogynephile. How is that helping your case at all? Well, I know Rocky Horror is problematic. But when you're living as a man, there aren't a lot of socially acceptable occasions to try out cross-dressing. You know, it's basically Rocky Horror, Halloween, pretty much any time it's socially allowed to be a freakish monster. And come to think of it, the scary monster autogynephile is a trope I've played with since the beginning of this channel. The whole Contrapoints aesthetic is very like autogynephilia chic. I originally was going to have the narrator of this channel be more of a fictional character. The idea was to be like autogynephile Harry Plinkett. And part of that is that I kind of hated myself. I thought I was just disgusting. Part of it is that representing yourself as a scary monster actually does capture something of the horror of gender dysphoria. And part of it is that identifying with the scary monster version of yourself is actually kind of empowering. Like cis feminists, you have your...
See, this is where I actually like Contrapoints a lot. I think she's pretty introspective and insightful, and I feel like she's so close. It's like I feel like part of the reason why she can't accept the autogynephilic theory, besides the obviously cancellation of her audience if she admitted that the theory had validity, is that there's so much stigma about admitting it and talking about it, and like and like talking about your sexuality as like a male. It's like this monster, this horror, you know, being seen as a pervert, as a fetishist, whatever, you know, saying that like these major life decisions are motivated by your sexuality or whatever, like that. There's just so much stigma in that. But if we break the stigma, if we remove the shame, the toxic shame associated with talking about male sexuality, talked about it openly and honestly, without this inflammatory rhetoric, without all this invective and, you know, all this political bullshit, you know, we could just be honest about the reality of the fact that there's cluster A and cluster B. And yeah, and we don't have to be ashamed about it. We don't have to hide it. We don't have to be in denial of it. We can just talk about it openly and honestly. And yeah, there's always going to be TERFs who are going to hate your guts no matter what. That's because, you know, the gender critical movement is it's a female supremacist feminist movement, basically. So like, I mean, that's not all it is, man. That's like a mischaracterization. But I'm just saying that, like, you know, like when you're dealing with feminists, there's just always going to be a level of like hatred and disgust of male sexuality because they just see like all the world's problems as like being due to men. So it's kind of like part of the like theory to just like hate on male sexuality and to think that it's evil. And you know, there's like, you know, they have their justifications for doing that, you know, given you know, usually histories of sexual objectification, etc. So anyway,
your thing about witches. Okay, but monster version or not, real women do not wear fishnets and garter belts and corsets. This is just male fetishism. Well, it's true that cis women generally don't dress that way, no. I mean, Unless they're doing Rocky Horror, it's actually pretty popular. But I never wear shit like that anymore. In fact, it actually causes gender dysphoria because it makes me feel like a male crossdresser. Sometimes trans women start out with a fairly male conception of what women wear. I guess that's true. A lot of trans women transition after a period of sort of trying things out as a crossdresser or a drag queen. But you know, it takes time to develop an authentic sense of female fashion. Like, what did you wear when you were 14? That's what I thought. But also, why not steal fashion ideas from drag queens and kinksters? Cis women do. They have some good ideas. Without drag queens and kinksters, we'd have no contouring, no chokers. And what would we do then, Abigail? What would we do then? I don't know what you would do. I think I could manage. Your Honor, I would like to admit into evidence the following clip.
Is there a way to smash my ribs in? I'll smash them in. I'll smash the shit out of them. These shoes are cute, and I'll finally be able to hit my head on the tops of door frames. Would you fuck me? I wouldn't.
Your Honor, the defendant literally tries on high heels and corsets in front of a mirror before posing to himself the question, would you fuck me? This, Your Honor, is peak trans.
Peak trans.
How do we even need to have a trial about this? Well, that scene depicts a kind of anguish, not sexual pleasure. Would you fuck me is obviously a reference to
Autogynephilists experience a lot of anguish. I'd say like anguish is like a fundamental phenomenological experience of the autogynephile. So yeah, that's not incompatible with being autogynephile.
Silence of the Lambs and is what is known in the trans community as a joke. The corsets, the high heels, these were primitive efforts at clawing my way out of manhood, and they're efforts that I've left behind. Now that I'm on female hormones and I live this way full time, I feel the way I'm supposed to feel, and I don't need to lean on that stuff for validation. I mean, I still do some things that cis women don't do. I sleep in a bra, which I'm pretty sure no cis woman has ever done. I do it because I need to feel something, God, anything, taking up space on my chest. And feeling that reassures me enough that I can fall asleep. Not so I can look at myself in the mirror, not so I can get off, so I can simply fall asleep. No one ever
Yeah, that's not typical of females. Like that's like, yeah.
claimed that trans women are literally the same as cis women. We have many experiences in common, but in other ways our experiences are very different. Yes, and you don't have the oppression experiences that cis women have. Well, you know what, Abigail? You're right. For the most part, I don't. But it's impossible for us to have an actual conversation about this because you're just such a fucking asshole. And if you honestly want to talk about trans women and oppression experiences, don't have this conversation with someone who started transitioning 5 months ago. Go find someone who transitioned decades ago and talk to them about their experiences as women. Your Honor, the defendant does not bleed. I find that pretty conclusive. As do I. Guilty as charged. 13. Final thoughts. I think some cis people will be very congratulatory towards me for making this video. Some of them will say things like, why can't all trans people be as calm and rational and open about their experiences as you? Well, I'm very happy if you found the video elucidating, but I'd like cis people to think a little bit harder about why not a lot of trans women talk about this. It's humiliating, it's exhausting, and it's required me to publicize a detailed analysis of my most private sexual feelings for the scrutiny of people who despise me. I've had to discuss things that I'm honestly terrified to discuss because I'm afraid that people will never take me seriously as a woman, hence ruining any chance I have at happiness. For trans women, this debate is intensely personal and risky. Our lives and happiness are at stake. Meanwhile,
So you're admitting that this all has to do with like personal hangups and insecurities and anxieties, and yet you're somehow claiming to do an objective scientific analysis of the research. And you're saying that Michael Bailey is biased because he's a white cis het man. Well, you're fundamentally biased because all this has to do with your personal self-image and insecurity and anxieties and self-esteem issues and all this stuff. So obviously there's massive bias. So all these, trans women out here trying to debunk autogynephilia, they obviously have a huge, personal motivating factor to do so that biases them towards a conclusion. So you can't say that, white cis het men are, totally biased, they're not objective. Well, you're not objective either, because this is clearly coming from a deeply personal place. It doesn't allow you to analyze things objectively.
While Blanchard and Bailey are not just neutral, devoted pursuers of scientific truth, they've continuously and needlessly been derisive and cruel toward trans people, and they've misused their power as academic authorities to misrepresent and humiliate us. No part of my present experience corresponds to the core claim of their theory. I may drape myself.
No part of your present experience, but it's a claim about your past experience, which is definitive of the ideological theory of the typology of cluster A and cluster B. And you're clearly cluster B.
In 100 layers of defensive irony and depravity, but I am at core a woman who is very thoroughly not in love with myself. So I have to hope, for the sake of my own happiness, that someday I will be loved by someone who thinks of me as a woman. Otherwise, I'm fucked. This has been a rough one, girls. I dare say you've earned a song.
Okay, that is it for this video. I'm tired. Actually, I actually did this video super late. It's 12:30 in the morning right now. I don't know. I just feel like doing this. I was really. That's kind of why I was tired too. I've been stuttering a lot in this video because I'm tired. But I felt compelled to do this. I needed to do this video. It's been on my mind. So. Okay, well, I'm almost coming up at 2 hours. So thanks for watching. And yeah, take care. Bye-bye.